The evening was soft, painted with the rustle of leaves and my daughter's giggles, until the saws roared in like a thief in the dusk. I stood in the garden, heart sinking into the soil, as the willow's arms fell, tearing down the treehouse we'd carved into its embrace. The air turned bitter with sawdust, each crack a stab through my chest, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the last plank thudded to the earth, a crumpled heap where Leila's dreams had perched. Margot Hensley stood at the gate, her pen poised like a dagger over her clipboard, her voice clipped and cold. "It's an eyesore against code." I turned, my hands trembling, coffee spilling from the mug I'd forgotten I held. The burn on my skin nothing compared to the ache inside. That treehouse was more than boards. It was us, weekends spent weaving ropes and secrets into the willow's arms. Leila's small fingers tracing the bark as I told her its story. How it breathed, how it lived. We'd sat there, her head on my shoulder, counting fireflies, whispering about the jungles I'd walked, the rivers I'd saved. Now, it was gone, her sanctuary shredded by a woman who saw only rules, not roots. I'm Lyndon Ashwood, not that Willowmere Lane knew. I'd stood before presidents, rallied crowds, my name etched in books and laws that guarded the wild. I'd come here 3 years ago, seeking silence after years of storms, lived in a modest house, drove a battered truck, let neighbors think I was just a dad with a garden. Margot didn't know, couldn't know, the hands she'd just scarred. She stood there, her blazer a stark line against the dusk, her smirk, a blade I felt, twist deeper, as Leila's sob broke the air. "Daddy, they took it." I pulled her close, her tears soaking my shirt, my voice lost in the lump, clawing my throat. The fury was there, a wildfire scorching my ribs, but beneath it, something quieter stirred, a root, deep and patient, curling through the grief. Margot had felled our treehouse. I'd plant a reckoning she'd never uproot. The night after the saws fell silent was a hollow ache, a darkness pressing against Willowmere Lane, the air heavy with the scent of sap and my unspoken rage. I sat on the back steps, the garden stretching before me like a wounded friend, the willow stumps jagged against the moonlit sky. Leila slept inside, her small frame curled under a blanket, her whimpers echoing in my ears long after they'd faded. The mug sat cold beside me, its stain a shadow on the wood, a reminder of the moment I'd lost more than a structure. I'd lost her trust in a world I'd promised to keep safe. I ran my hands over the grass, its dampness clinging to my fingers, grounding me as the wildfire in my chest threatened to blaze free. Margot's voice replayed, against code, a petty mantra that mocked the life she'd severed. She didn't see the willow's roots, didn't hear Leila's dreams in its branches. She saw lines on a page, a box to check, a power to wield. I'd built that treehouse with my own hands, calluses earned from nails and love, not permits, hands that had once planted saplings and deforested scars across continents. I'm Lyndon Ashwood, though here I was just Rowan, the quiet guy with a kid. I'd stood on podiums, my voice a thunder that shifted laws, my name a shield for the wild. I'd chosen this lane for its stillness, a refuge after years of battles, yet here I was, ambushed by a woman with a clipboard and no soul. Her smugness gnawed at me, her ignorance, a splinter I couldn't pull free. I could have roared, called the press, unleashed the storm I'd wielded before, but not yet. The ache demanded more than fury, it demanded purpose. I rose, my shadow long against the ruined tree, the wind whispering through what remained. Leila's sob, "They took it," was a seed sinking deeper, rooting in my silence. Margot thought she'd won, her rules a wall unbreached. She didn't know the wildfire was banking, the storm gathering slow. She'd torn our refuge. I'd grow a lesson she'd never outlast. The dawn after the storm brewed was a fragile breath, a light creeping soft over Willowmere Lane, the air tinged with dew, and the faint pulse of my resolve. I stood in the garden, coffee cold in my grip, the willow's stumps staring back like broken promises. Lascephaled out, her pajama sleeves too long, her eyes red but curious as she knelt by the wreckage, her small hand tracing a splintered plank. "Can we fix it, Daddy?" she asked, her voice a thread pulling at my heart, unraveling the fury into something sharper, hope. I set the mug down, its clink swallowed by the morning's hush, and knelt beside her, my fingers brushing hers over the wood. "Not this one," I said, soft, the ache tightening my throat, "but we'll grow something better." Her nod was small, trusting, a seed of light piercing the grief. That treehouse had been our haven, nights of stories, her giggles mingling with the leaves, but Margot's chainsaws had left more than rubble. They'd left a question I couldn't ignore. How do I teach her resilience when the world cuts so deep? I'm Lyndon Ashwood, though here, I was just her dad, the guy who'd built a treehouse without a form. I'd walked rainforests, my boots sinking into soil. I'd saved, my name a whisper in halls of power. I'd hidden here, craving quiet, yet Margot's smug eyesore had ripped through that veil, exposing a wound I hadn't expected. I could have called my contacts, editors, lawmakers, friends who'd amplify this, but the seed in me stirred differently, patient and green, rooting in Lila's trust. I rose, pulling her up with me, her hand small in mine, as we faced the stumps. The wildfire simmered, but the storm shifted, less rage, more purpose, a root curling deep. Margot thought she'd cleared her ledger. She didn't see the growth beneath. She'd felled our treehouse. I'd plant a forest she'd never contain. The afternoon after the seed sprouted was a quiet awakening, a warmth rising slow over Willowmere Lane, the air alive with the scent of earth and my growing intent. I stood in the garden, a shovel in my hands, Lila beside me with a sapling, its roots wrapped in burlap, a fragile hope we'd plant where the willow once stood. The stumps loomed, a scar I couldn't erase, but the soil beneath them pulsed, ready to cradle something new. Her small hands dug beside mine, her hum a melody threading through the silence, a balm over the ache that lingered. I sank the blade deep, the earth yielding soft, each scoop a release of the wildfire I'd held. Margot's voice, against code, faded, replaced by Lila's giggle as dirt streaked her cheeks, her trust a root spreading through me. I'd built that treehouse to show her the wild, nights whispering about the Amazon, the taiga, places I'd fought for. But this sapling was more, a lesson in growth, in rising from ruin. She didn't ask why anymore. She planted, her faith in me a quiet fire I hadn't earned, but would keep. I'm Lyndon Ashwood, though here, I was just her shadow, the man who'd failed her once. I'd stood before crowds, my words a wind that bent policy, my name a shield for the green. I'd hidden here, craving peace, yet Margot's chainsaws had torn that apart, leaving a wound I'd turned into soil. I could have unleashed hell, press releases, protests, but the roots spread slower, deeper, curling through the pack. Thompson's truck rumbled past, his nod sharp. Carter's gate creaked, her eyes curious. They'd seen the saws, heard the crash, a whisper stirring. I straightened, the sapling steady in its hole, Lila's hands patting the dirt. The ache eased, the wildfire banking into embers, a storm turning green. Margot thought she'd won, her rules a wall unbreached. She didn't see the roots threading through, the pack waking soft. She'd torn our refuge. I'd grow a legacy she'd never outgrow. The evening after the roots spread was a restless murmur, a breeze stirring soft over Willowmere Lane, the air laced with the scent of damp earth and my quiet defiance. I sat on the porch, Lila curled beside me under a blanket, her small breath steady as she clutched a sketch of the sapling we'd planted, its pencil lines shaky but sure. The garden stretched dark before us, the willow stumps a silent chorus under the stars, their absence a hollow I felt in my bones. But the sapling stood, frail yet firm, a whisper of green against the dusk, a promise I'd made her, a vow I'd keep. I leaned back, the wood creaking under me, my hands tracing the blanket's edge as the wind rustled through the leaves beyond our fence. That treehouse had been our perch, Lila's laughter threading through the branches, her questions about the wild, a song I'd answered with tales of forests I'd walked. Margot's chainsaws had silenced it, her eyesore a blade that cut deeper than wood, slicing into the trust I'd built with my daughter. The ache lingered, a bruise I couldn't press away, but the wind carried something else, murmurs from the lane, voices I hadn't called but felt. Thompson's gate clanged, his heavy steps pausing as he peered over, his silhouette a question against the dusk. Heard the saws. Damn shame, he grunted, low enough not to wake her, his eyes on the stumps. Carter's porch light flickered on, her shadow shifting as she stepped out, her voice soft but sharp. She went too far. Leela's tree. I nodded, my throat tight, the sapling's shadow swaying in the breeze, a seed they'd seen, a root they'd felt. I'm Lyndon Ashwood, though here, I was just her dad, the man who'd lost a treehouse. I'd rallied nations, my voice a wind that bent steel, my name a shield for the wild. I'd hidden here, craving stillness, yet Margot's smugness had torn that apart, leaving a wound I'd turned to soil. The pack stirred, their whispers a current. I hadn't sparked but couldn't stop, the wind carrying it wider. She thought she'd felled a nuisance. She didn't see the storm rising soft, the roots threading through the lane. The morning after the wind whispered was a tender awakening, a light breaking gentle over Willowmere Lane, the air alive with the scent of wet soil and my growing purpose. I stood in the garden, a trowel in my hand, Leela beside me with a watering can, its spout dripping as she tipped it over the sapling, her hum a melody threading through the dawn. The willow's stumps loomed, a silent jury watching us work, their jagged edges softening under moss. I hadn't noticed before. The sapling stretched, its leaves trembling with new life, a quiet pulse I felt in my chest, a healing I hadn't planned. I sank the trowel deep, the earth cool against my fingers, each scoop a release of the ache I'd carried. Leela's question, "Can we fix it?" echoed, her trust a root I'd nurture, a green stronger than the wildfire I'd held. That treehouse had been our haven, her small hands gripping ropes, my voice weaving tales of the wild. Ah, but this sapling was more, a testament, a lesson in growth over ruin. She giggled as water splashed her shoes, her joy, a balm I drank deep, the grief fading into the soil like rain. I'm Lyndon Ashwood, though here I was just her shadow, the man who'd planted a seed. I'd stood in jungles, my boots sinking into earth I'd saved, my name a whisper in the wind that shaped laws. I'd chosen this lane for its peace, yet Margot's chainsaws had torn that apart, leaving a wound I'd turned to soil. The pack grew, Thompson hauling mulch, Carter with a seedling, their eyes on the sapling, a quiet chorus I hadn't called but felt. "Looks good," Thompson said, his voice gruff, dropping the bag. Carter nodded, her hands gentle, "For Leela." I straightened, the sapling steady, Leela's hum rising soft. The ache eased, the wildfire banking into embers, a purpose rooting deep. Margot thought she'd cleared a blemish. She didn't hear the soil speaking, the pack joining slow. She'd felled our refuge. I'd sown a seed she'd never outgrow. The afternoon after the soil spoke was a rising swell, a warmth pulsing sharp over Willowmere Lane, the air alive with the scent of mulch and my quiet resolve. I stood in the garden, Lila beside me with a paintbrush, its bristles streaked yellow as she dabbed a sign. Lila's tree, her letters wobbly but bold. The sapling stretched, its leaves catching the sun, a fragile banner against the stump's shadow. The pack gathered, Thompson with a spade, Carter with a watering can, neighbors I'd barely known, peering over fences, their murmurs a swell I hadn't summoned, but couldn't silence. I leaned on the shovel, my hands steady, the earth firm beneath my boots as I watched them work. Thompson digging, Carter pouring, their hands joining ours without a word. That treehouse had been our secret, Lila's laughter in the branches, my stories of the wild, but Margot's saws had torn it open, her code a lash that woke the lane. The ache lingered, a faint bruise, but the swell drowned it, their voices rising soft. Thompson's gruff, "She's a fool." Carter's sharp, "It was beautiful." Lila painted on, her hum a thread weaving through, her trust a root I'd shield. I'm Lyndon Ashwood, though here I was just her dad, the man who'd lost a treehouse. I'd stood before crowds, my voice a swell that shifted continents, my name a shield for the green. I'd hidden here, craving quiet, yet Margot's smugness had torn that apart, leaving a wound I'd turned to growth. The pack swelled, neighbors I'd nodded to, now kneeling in the dirt, their hands planting seedlings I hadn't asked for, a chorus I'd sparked without speaking. For Lila, Carter said, her voice firm, setting a sapling down. I straightened, the sapling steady, Lila's sign swaying soft. The ache faded, the wildfire turning green, a voice rising clear. Margot thought she'd felled a nuisance. She didn't hear the whisper growing loud, the pack taking root. She'd torn our refuge. I'd sown a movement she'd never contain. The evening after the voice swelled was a breaking swell, a light fading fierce over Willowmere Lane, the air thick with earth and my quiet triumph. I stood in the garden, Leela beside me with her watering can, its drip a steady pulse as she tended the saplings, now 3. Their leaves trembling under the dusk. The stumps loomed, a jury softened by time, their edges blurred with moss and memory. The pack gathered, Thompson, Carter, neighbors I'd never named, tools in hand, their voices a swell I'd sparked but couldn't control, a storm breaking soft over the lane. I leaned on the fence, my hands steady, the sapling shadows stretching long as the sun dipped low. That treehouse had been our perch, Leela's giggles in the wind, my tales of the wild. But Margot's saws had torn it down, her eyes saw a lash that woke something deeper. The ache lingered, a faint echo, but the swell drowned it. Thompson's spade sinking deep, Carter's hands planting firm, their quiet, joining a chorus I'd felt but never led. She's a fool, Thompson muttered, his voice rough, dirt streaking his arms. This is better, Carter added, her eyes on Leela. I'm Lyndon Ashwood, though here I was just her dad, the man who'd lost a treehouse. I'd stood in rainforests, my voice a storm that bent steel, my name a shield for the wild. I'd chosen this lane for its hush, yet Margot's smugness had torn that apart, leaving a wound I'd turned to green. The pack broke soft, neighbors planting, kids watching, a swell I'd sown with a seed, not a shout. Leela's hum rose, her can tipping, her trust a root I'd shield. I straightened, the saplings steady, the lane alive with their hands. The ache faded, the wildfire gone, a storm breaking soft but sure. Margot thought she'd felled a blemish. She didn't see the swell rising, the pack growing loud. She'd torn our refuge. I'd grown a forest she'd never uproot. The morning after the storm broke soft was a quiet uprising, a light spilling fierce over Willowmere Lane, the air alive with the scent of fresh leaves and my swelling purpose. I stood in the garden, Leela beside me with a handful of acorns, her small fingers clutching them like treasures, her eyes bright as she scattered them around the saplings. The stumps stood silent, their jagged edges softening under a carpet of moss, a jury yielding to the green we'd sown. The pack swelled, Thompson with a rake, Carter with a basket of seedlings, neighbors I'd never named gathering slow, their hands joining ours in a chorus I'd felt but never called. I knelt, my hands sinking into the soil, the earth cool and yielding as I pressed an acorn deep, Leela's hum a melody threading through the dawn. The treehouse was gone, its planks a memory, Leela's laughter a ghost in the wind, but these saplings were more. A voice, a whisper growing loud, a legacy rising from the ruin Margot's saws had left. The ache lingered, a faint scar, but the leaves spoke, Thompson's rake scraping steady, Carter's hands planting firm, their quiet joining a swell I'd sparked with a seed, not a shout. For Leela, Carter murmured, her voice soft, setting a seedling down. Thompson nodded, his gruff, damn right, a root sinking deep. I'm Lyndon Ashwood, though here I was just her dad, the man who'd lost a treehouse. I'd stood in jungles, my voice a wind that bent steel, my name a shield for the wild. I'd chosen this lane for its hush, yet Margot's smug code had torn that apart, leaving a wound I'd turned to green. The pack spoke, neighbors I'd nodded to, now kneeling in the dirt, kids scattering seeds, a swell I'd sown without a word. Leela's acorns fell, her giggle rising, her trust a root I'd shield. I rose, the saplings trembling, the lane alive with their hands. The ache faded, the wildfire gone, a voice breaking clear. Margot thought she'd cleared a blemish. She didn't hear the leaves speaking, the pack growing loud. She'd felled our refuge. I'd grown a chorus. she'd never silence. The afternoon after the leaves spoke was a bold awakening, a warmth pulsing fierce over Willowmere Lane, the air thick with mulch and my quiet triumph. I stood in the garden, Leela beside me with a watering can, its spout dripping as she danced between the saplings, now 5, their leaves stretching under the sun like a fragile canopy. The stumps loomed, a jury-turned choir, their edges blurred by moss and time, singing with the green we'd sown. The pack swelled, Thompson with a shovel, Carter with a seedling tray, neighbors I'd never named digging deep, their hands a swell I'd sparked but couldn't contain. I leaned on the shovel, my hands steady, the sapling's shadows stretching long as the sun climbed high. The treehouse was a ghost, Leela's giggles in the branches, my tales of the wild. But this canopy was more a testament, a rising song, a legacy breaking through the ruin. Margot's saws had carved, the ache lingered, a faint echo, but the swell drowned it. Thompson's shovel sinking deep, Carter's hands planting firm, their quiet joining a chorus I'd felt but never led. She'd hate this, Thompson grunted, his voice rough, dirt streaking his arms. Good, Carter replied, her eyes on Leela, her seedling rooted firm. I'm Lyndon Ashwood, though here I was just her dad, the man who'd lost a treehouse. I'd stood before nations, my voice a thunder that shifted laws, my name a canopy for the wild. I'd chosen this lane for its peace, yet Margot's smug eyesore had torn that apart, leaving a wound I'd turned to growth. The pack rose, neighbors I'd passed now planting roots, kids watering saplings, a swell I'd sown with a seed, not a shout. Leela's can tipped, her laughter rising, her trust a root I'd shield. I straightened, the canopy trembling, the lane alive with their hands. The ache faded, the wildfire gone, a triumph breaking bold. Margot thought she'd felled a nuisance. She didn't see the canopy rising, the pack growing fierce. She'd torn our refuge. I'd grown a forest she'd never outclimb. The evening after the canopy rose was a fierce breaking, a light fading bold over Willowmere Lane, the air thick with earth and my quiet resolve. I stood in the clubhouse, Leela beside me with her sketch, its pencil lines wobbly but proud, a drawing of the saplings now 10, their leaves a banner against the dusk. The stumps were gone, their scars buried under soil and green, a choir drowned by the swell I'd sown. The pack filled the room, Thompson with his spade, Carter with her tray, neighbors I'd never named, their eyes sharp, their voices a swell I'd sparked, and now led. I stepped forward, my boots steady on the hardwood, the sketch a quiet weight in my hand as I faced Margot, her blazer stiff, her clipboard trembling, her eyes wide with a panic she couldn't hide. The treehouse was a memory, Leela's laughter in the wind, my tales of the wild. But this canopy was more, a truth, a reckoning, a legacy blooming from the ruin she'd carved. The ache lingered, a faint whisper, but the swell drowned it. Thompson's gruff nod, Carter's sharp glare, their quiet joining a chorus I'd felt and now voiced. You tore it down, I said, my voice low, cutting through her silence. No vote, no right, she flinched, her pen hovering, her voice a thin thread snapping. It was against code. I held up the sketch, then a book, my face on the cover, Guardians of the Green, my name blazing. Lyndon Ashwood. I'm an environmentalist, I said, steady, fierce, saved forests you'd never see, billions know me. You felled my daughter's treehouse. The room surged. Thompson's growl, she's done. Carter's sharp, you idiot, neighbors gasping, their eyes wide as the truth blossomed. Margot shrank, her clipboard slipping, her face pale as the stumps she'd left. I'd hidden here, yet her saws had torn that apart, leaving a wound I'd turned to green. Leela's hand squeezed mine, her trust a root I'd shield. I straightened, the canopy steady, the lane alive with their voices. The ache vanished, the wildfire gone, a truth breaking fierce. Margot thought she'd felled a nuisance. She didn't see the forest blooming, the pack roaring loud. She'd torn our refuge. I'd grown a truth she'd never outshine. The dawn after the truth broke was a steady rooting, a light spilling soft over Willowmere Lane, the air alive with cedar and my quiet peace. I stood in the garden, Lissa beside me with her watering can, its drip a steady pulse as she tended the saplings, now a dozen, their leaves a canopy stretching under the sun. The stumps were gone, their scars buried under soil and green, a choir silenced by the forest we'd sown. The pack stood with us, Thompson, Carter, neighbors I'd never named, their hands planting, their voices a hum I'd sparked and now shared. I leaned on the fence, my hands steady, the sapling shadows stretching long as the sun climbed high. The treehouse was a memory, Lucid's giggles in the branches, my tales of the wild. But this forest was more, a legacy, a harmony, a truth rising from the ruin. Margot's saws had carved, the ache was gone, the wildfire stilled, a peace rooting deep. Thompson's spade steady, Carter's hands gentle, their quiet joining a chorus I'd felt, and now lived. She's fined, shamed, Thompson said, his voice gruff, nodding at her dark house. Good, Carter added, her eyes on Lissets of Lang. I'm Lyndon Ashwood, here. I was her dad, the man who'd lost a treehouse and found a forest. I'd stood before the world, my voice a wind that bent steel, my name a shield for the wild. I'd chosen this lane for its hush, yet Margot's smug code had torn that apart, leaving a wound I'd turned to green. The pack stood, neighbors planting, kids laughing, a forest I'd sown with a seed, not a storm. Lucid's can tipped, her laughter rising, her trust a root I'd shield. I straightened, the forest steady, the lane alive with their hands. The wildfire was gone, a peace breaking soft and sure. Margot thought she'd felled a blemish. She didn't see the forest standing, the pack growing tall. She'd torn our refuge. I'd planted a peace she'd never outgrow.